All right. Hello, everyone. Well, I am the dramatic historian, and I'm lucky enough to be speaking here with Dan Masters, who is author of Hell's Half Acre. So thanks for coming on, Dan.
Well, thank you very much. An honor to be here.
Well, I actually have to start with why the title of the book, Hell's Half Acre? What is that? Why did you decide on that for your title?
Well, so it's Hell by the Acre. Hell's Half Acre is actually a place on the Stones River battlefield. But how we landed on that title, that was not the book's original title. We went through a couple of different iterations. I think its initial working title was Adrift in a Sea of Blood, which is a line from the Gettysburg movie. You might remember General Lee mentions that the country's adrift in a sea of blood and he wants it to end right here. I always thought that was a really good phrase. And I think I've tried to use that on a couple different books. I keep getting shot down with it. So I don't know if I'm going to use that one anymore. But really thinking about the intensity of the combat there, how it was such a close thing for both sides. There was the line actually comes from Lieutenant Colonel James Niebling of the 21st Ohio. If you might read the in the introduction of the book, I talk about what drew me to the Stones River story first was learning about my Uncle Jim, who was mortally wounded in action at Stones River, serving in the 21st Ohio. Well, as the regiment was kind of under its first real serious engagement, Colonel Niebling kept walking behind the lines, swinging his sword, telling the boys, "Give them hell by the acre, boys, give them hell by the acre." And not that many years ago, I had the honor to actually hold the sword that he was using at Stones River. I mean, it was a pretty amazing thing. So when the initial working title was rejected, shall we say, by the publisher, I had a list of like 15 alternates, and that's the one that jumped out. Ted really liked that one, so that's what we went with. And it connecting in with what drew me into the story from the get-go was, I guess, a lucky bit of serendipity.
Well, I think it's a great title, and hopefully we'll get around to talking about the place here on the battlefield in just a moment. But I first actually have to ask, what was it that first actually drew you to the Battle of Stones River, like as a subject?
The family connections. I had 3 family members who fought in the battle. One, like I said, and Uncle Jim didn't make it. He was the family's only, I guess, the only combat death from the war was he was it. And so that drew me in. I had my 3rd great grandfather. He was there at the 1st Ohio Cavalry. My 2nd great grandfather was there with the 37th Indiana, which is in the same brigade as the 21st Ohio. Of course, the families were not, were not together at that point. They, one's from Southern Indiana, the other's from the swamps of Northwestern Ohio. So it was the family connection first. But as I was kind of getting into the Civil War in general, Stones River really stuck out at me as it was a fascinating battle because you could argue either way that either army could have won that battle. It was really that close. So the intensity of the combat was certainly intriguing. I'm not going to lie, I tend to have a soft spot for William S. Rosecrans, so having an opportunity to kind of do an in-depth, deeper study on that was exciting, and seeing that there was a bit of a space, shall we say, a space in the literature for it. You look at a campaign like Chickamauga, which is a fascinating campaign. I don't know that Dave Powell's. It's not even a trilogy. It's like 5 books. I don't know if that's the last word on the subject, but it's the last word for a while. So, as an author, you're looking for things, A, to get you excited, but B, also where there's some room in the marketplace, shall we say. Like how the folks do a new Gettysburg book every year is that's a little beyond. I just it's like there are so many good books out there. Do we need a new one? Well, apparently we need 30 or 40 or 100 a year. So
Yeah, and I might be getting a little bit ahead of myself. I was planning on asking you this question later, but it seems
Mhm.
to be relevant now, which is why is it that you think Stones River does not get the same attention as places like Gettysburg or even Antietam? I mean, you mentioned yourself that is a very closely fought battle, and so you would think that something like that would actually be um, very unique within history and something that people would be more drawn to.
well, a couple of things. There's things that Stones River has and things that Stones River doesn't have. It is a Western theater battle. Those traditionally have received less scholarly attention than the Eastern theater. That has changed over the last 30 or so years. But you go back to the time of the Civil War centennial, and largely a lot of that was focused on the war in Virginia, or Gettysburg as the major turning point, or Vicksburg. If you're going to look at the West, people were looking at more Vicksburg. What happened in the Middle Tennessee area, I think, was not deemed as maybe not as important, not as decisive. And I can understand that. Most of the when you look at the history of the Army of the Cumberland and the Army of Tennessee, most of their battles are usually intensely bloody. They're very closely fought, and they don't seem to. We'll say they don't really decide things. The Battle of Perryville is a good example. I mean, that happened October 8th, 1862. It was a very short battle, but a very bloody battle. But it did not decide the Kentucky campaign. The Confederates were already on their way out. So that decision had already been made. So it was just kind of like this bloody clash as they were exiting the building. Stones River, I think, was a little more decisive, but when you look at it from the standpoint of, was there, massive amounts of land that changed hands? No, not really. The war continued for another almost 2.5 years afterwards, so one can hardly say that it was, decisive. The way we would look at Vicksburg or Gettysburg as, decisive turning points. I think it was a very important turning point, but it was not the decisive one that decided the war for the Union. From a Confederate perspective, the biggest thing that it's missing is Robert E. Lee wasn't there. And he gets a ton of scholarly attention. He's broadly looked upon as one of the finest commanders of the war. Certainly, Southern historians have praised him to the moon. The Confederate commander there is Braxton Bragg, who is, I think, seeing something of a resurgence in appreciation for his contributions, in the last 10 years, but has traditionally been kind of considered, like the bad man of the war. And so there's, the things that draw popular attention are kind of absent from Stones River that you might have at, other battlefields, especially in the East.
Right. Yeah, that was kind of my thinking as well. But where the Stones River campaign, I'll go ahead and just call it a campaign. So where did the Stones River campaign actually fit strategically then for both armies in late 1862? What did that actually look like?
So for the Army of the Cumberland, which was General Rosecrans' command, Stones River is really the first step on the road back to Chattanooga. To kind of understand the Stones River story, you have to understand that in the summer of 1862, the Federal Army was occupying as far south as Huntsville, and they were essentially knocking on the door to Chattanooga when Bragg and Kirby Smith launched their attack into Kentucky, which eventually Don Carlos Buell abandoned those positions. But so the Federal Army had almost taken Chattanooga once already in the summer of 62. After marching all the way back to Louisville and basically starting over again, they come back to Nashville after the Battle of Perryville, and the Confederate Army has also retreated out of Kentucky and gone all the way back to Murfreesboro, because that's where they had some forces there during the fall. So for the Confederacy, it is all about recover. They really want to recover Middle Tennessee for logistic and supply reasons. Middle Tennessee was a very rich farming region. And more importantly, during the summer of '62, it was under federal occupation, and the local farmers had put in a huge crop. Well, when it came harvest time, the armies were by and large out of the area. So the farmers were able to actually, pull in this crop without interference. And it's now sitting in, barns and bins all over the region, waiting for the armies to come, to lay claim to it. The logistic problems that both armies had meant that they had to really rely upon the land to keep themselves provisioned. The Confederate Army maybe a little more so from the standpoint of feeding the troops. The Federal Army a little more from the standpoint of gathering forage for their horses and mules. But Middle Tennessee was a fiercely contested region because it was a bit of a breadbasket. The Confederate Army, Bragg had all sorts of difficulties that, the foraging regions in his immediate rear were designated to supply the Army of Northern Virginia, not the Army of Tennessee. So he really needed very local supply to really keep himself in the field. So the Confederate objective here is basically to hold the ground. I mean, it is Tennessee. It was a state that had seceded. And the ultimate federal objective is to seize Chattanooga. Now, both armies would contest over this for really the better part of 1863. Really wasn't decided until after the Battle of Missionary Ridge. But that's really what both armies were kind of after at this point in time.
Well, you hit on this a little bit, and it was actually a very interesting part of your book. Which I'm curious, what was the morale like of each contending side? Because I noticed that you spoke to uniformity within the Confederate soldiers and their dress in particular, and it reminded me a lot of like the Austro-Hungarian army of like the 19th century, where it's like they're wearing different uniforms. More intensely, they're speaking different languages. But if you just wanted
I would offer the Confederate Army spoke some different languages too. A lot of those Louisiana Creole units didn't speak English very well. So they a couple of regiments in particular, the 13th and 20th Louisiana, which I think were out in New Orleans, had soldiers of many different nationalities. So yeah. There's, I think, more parallels there than maybe we think at first glance. But yeah, certainly their uniforms tended to become a little more homogenous as the war went on. But they certainly started off with quite a wild divergence to begin with, as did the Federal Army in some ways. I mean, we always think of them as, well, they always had the blue uniform, right? Well,
yeah.
I'm currently working on a memoir from a captain in the 15th Indiana who's complaining when they first went out that they went out in suits of dirty gray, and they were embarrassed by this because they thought they look like ruffians, and so they all then go out in blue. Now I think he went out in June of '61. By October, they were in blue uniforms. But so the Federal Army became much more homogenous as the war went on too. I think the Confederate Army was always quite colorful in its variety dress, largely because the supply challenges that they had. I think one of my favorite stories is years ago I used to reenact with 14th Ohio, 3rd Arkansas, and when we did 3rd Arkansas, there was a bit of a debate in the unit about depending on when we were going to depict. Like if we were depicting them at Chickamauga, it was deemed okay for us to wear these really dark blue short coats. And that was because the unit had received a bunch of these English coats right before they went to Georgia. And they're almost like black. I mean, they were really sharp, loved how they looked. They were a lot of fun to wear.
Yeah.
But just to think, we always think of them as just gray and butternut, but, there's lots of different shades of gray and lots of different shades of butternut. And so, yeah, very... it'd certainly be a feast for the eye. I would, how many of us would love to just go back to one a review for the Army of Tennessee, maybe the one they do at Murfreesboro when Davis is there, just to really see that. What do they look like up close? Maybe we get Robert Lee Hodge to model for us or something.
Well, I was just appreciative that you included that within the book, because I feel like a lot of times, like, I understand obviously talking about the battle is like the most significant part of it, but including that little detail to it, I think adds like this extra layer that really is able to get the reader to think of or imagine what they looked like. Because you're right, we typically think, okay, they wore gray, they wore blue, and that's the end of that, but that's just is not the case. And I also think it points to the logistical difficulties that each side may be facing at the same time as well. But before I actually get into the battle itself, I was wondering if you could actually just give like a brief description or kind of like an outline of what the battlefield at Stones River actually looks like, or some key elements to it, before I start asking about it.
Okay. As in how it looks today, or how it looked at the time of the battle?
How it looked at the time.
I was going to say, what it looks like today, it is, massively developed and hard to give a tour.
Yeah.
During the time of the battle, I mean, Murfreesboro is the county seat of Rutherford County, so it does it as a courthouse. I mean, it's a substantial town of a couple thousand people. By and large, it is surrounded by subsistence farmers and some plantations. Not a lot of them, but there were a few plantations in the area. Various wheat fields, corn was certainly a very important crop. There were some cotton fields. I think actually one in particular is right near the Round Forest. And I don't know if we talk too much about that in the book, but during the battle, the soldiers would grab cotton bolls and put the cotton in their ears because the noise of the battle was so loud. The cotton hadn't been harvested. By and large, it is relatively flat terrain. There is some light rolling to it, but this is nothing like Pickett's Mill in Georgia. It's relatively flat fields. A little more topography closer to Stones River itself. There's Wayne's Hill. There's a piece of land that I call Reich's Ridge in the book. There's McFadden's Heights. But as I said, most of we'll call it the high ground, is really near the river itself. You get much further away from the river. It's relatively flat or lightly rolling. Some heavy forest in places, particularly in the cedar forest near the Nashville Pike. There is some good roads. The Nashville Pike was thinking, how do we say the word? It was a hard road. Macadamized, I think is the phrase. None of the other roads in the area really were. Most of them were dirt roads, but some of them were pretty frequently traveled and were a decent state of repair. And then you got cow paths too. So there's kind of a mixture. A decent population, not like thousands of people. I mean, there might have been a couple thousand in Murfreesboro itself, but your typical rural Tennessee population density. Fair number of slaves lived there in 1860. It is a very open question of how many were left by the Stones River period. The Federal Army had already occupied Murfreesboro in March of '62, and they held it until September of '62. I got to think that any enslaved folks that were there were either moved further south or had taken the opportunity to secure their freedom and head north. So I'm not, and in all the accounts I've read, I've seen very, very few mentions of any slaves in the area at the time. It doesn't mean they're there. Lots of times they're there and nobody mentions them. It's kind of a gap in the historical record. But so I hope that I know that answers kind of what you're looking for. It's just kind of a broad general description of the area.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I just wanted to get a depiction of this area that's, unfortunately, there's going to be high casualties. And that was one thing that really shocked me was, just the number of of deaths and just kind of the chaotic fighting that took place. And when the fighting actually opens up in your book, what was it that actually made the morning attack so chaotic?
So kind of set that the evening of December 30th, McCook's wing, they later would be called Corps, but at the time of Stones River, they had the right wing, the left wing, and the center corps. The right wings under Alexander McDowell McCook. They had moved onto the battlefield throughout the day on the 30th, and the last division to move into position was Richard Johnston's, which went all the way out on the right flank of the Army. Now, they didn't get into position until almost nightfall, and the position they took didn't have a lot of shall we say, benefits to defense. It was largely a position adopted more by happenstance. And Johnson himself is he's very responsible for this, in my opinion. It's not to say that there were not other officers under his command who recommended that they take a different position. Warren Parker Edgerton, who was the chief of artillery, suggested that all the batteries of the division be moved back a couple hundred yards to just south of what I call the Jenkins Woodlot. There was a bit, if you go to Stones River today and ride on Gresham Lane heading north, you'll see that there's a slight rise and then it kind of it reaches its peak and just stays there. Well, that's where he wanted to line those guns up, because he would have this beautiful field of fire in front of him. That's what you need for artillery. You need open spaces. Well, the way they were deployed, essentially at the south end of a stretch of woods, really didn't give him that field of fire that he was looking for. So the reason that the attack was so devastating when it started, a couple of things, some tactically smart decisions on the part of the Confederates. They did stack several divisions on what for them was their far left. There was John Porter McCown's division, which launched the attack. Right behind them was Patrick Claiborne's division, which was a large division of 4 brigades. And they even juiced it up a little more by putting 2,500 or so Confederate cavalry on the extreme left, with orders to, once the infantry is engaged, to swoop around and get in the Federal rear. It was the combination of those things, as well as the directive to the soldiers not to use the rebel yell in the initial attack. So that initial attack was done, we'll say 6:15 in the morning. So it was dark. They weren't making a whole lot of noise. And frankly, the Federal troops were not expecting to be hit. They really were not in a position of defense, especially August Phillips Brigade, which was more or less in camp. And the Confederates approached very quickly. And now the Federals had lots of skirmishers out there. I mean, there was a whole cloud of skirmishers in front of both of the brigades that were hit. But they essentially served as a tripwire and not much more. They were not any. Once McCown got his men going, there wasn't a whole lot of way of impediments, and the armies really were not that far apart. Maybe 300 to 400 yards at the most. I don't think the Union troops really engaged them till they were probably maybe 200 yards out from the main Federal camps, and troops on the move can cover 200 yards pretty quickly.
What were some of the troops or units that displayed really exceptional discipline on fighting when it first broke out?
Well, unfortunately, I can't say too many of the troops from Johnson's division. Those 2 brigades there both were driven off the field fairly quickly. There was some blundering on the part of deploying the troops. I think the poor troops of the 15th Ohio, when the battle started, the Confederates were essentially attacking in their rear. The colonel formed them into line and was trying to spin them around, and they, of course, kind of went to pieces. And they were veterans of Shiloh. These are the same troops that are going to take Liberty Gap in June, and they hold the line at Chickamauga in September. So these aren't like cowardly troops or anything. They got caught in a really bad position and suffered the consequences. Really, the brigades that start really showing some sand would be Philemon Baldwin's brigade, which fights probably around 7:30. Peace Sending Post Brigade, and really most of the units of the right wing, I think, fight fairly well, with the exception of Kirk and Villick's brigade, and I think that largely because they were caught in a bad position. On the Confederate side, have always been very impressed with Ector's Texas Brigade, which seizes Battery E, the 1st Ohio Light Artillery. And takes the colors of the 34th Illinois within moments of one another. So they start off the battle with a couple of high points. St. John Richardson Liddell's Arkansans, as a whole, I rated some of the finest troops in the Confederate Army. They certainly make a pretty impressive showing, especially early in the day. And then it's the Battle of the Veldt. Certainly most of the troops in Sheridan's division do pretty well. Especially, I'm thinking of the Roberts Brigade, 22nd, 27th, 42nd, 51st Illinois. Really put on a pretty impressive demonstration of defensive fighting, probably around 10 o'clock that morning. So, yeah, there's definitely some very good troops here. Unfortunately, all these things I've just talked about, little or no of that land is preserved at Stones River today. So it's really difficult to tell the story on the ground because it's just so grown up with neighborhoods and businesses and whatnot.
Oh, well, that's too bad. I have a few questions about that later. One of the things that you actually do really well when you're describing all these events and is the fact that you're telling this story from lower echelons of command. A lot of times we see battle histories written from officers at the very top, and it's kind of this top-down view of the actual battle itself. But one of the just really impressive things that I mean, at least I was really impressed by, was you being able to tell this story from individual soldiers that were on the front line experiencing the fighting. And what was the purpose of you actually telling the story this way?
That was deliberate. And it largely stemmed from an appreciation of kind of where we were at in the literature, and knowing that Stones River's been written before by very able historians. McDonough, Pete Cousins, Larry Daniel, they've all done, Chris Kolakowski, they've all done some really nice work on Stones River. But they generally kind of adopted, we'll call it the same game plan, generally using the OR to kind of, the official records to kind of drive the narrative. And really, when I looked at that, I was like, I really want to know what was this, the parts that I found of those books that got me the most excited is when they're, bringing those voices out of the ranks to describe what things are like. And my thought was like, I wonder if we could put a book together that told the story from their perspective on both sides. That did me an awful lot of research. I have 4 bankers boxes worth of stuff that I've gathered over the years. It does, historians love to put order. I mean, that's really why we do. We're trying to make sense of and put in order how things had happened. Battle by its very, very nature is very chaotic. And it struck me very early on that every man, and there's women too, that participate in this battle. Most of them are kind of silent voices. But the battle experience for them is very, very chaotic. And it was very difficult for them to, you'll see it in a lot of accounts, I can't put into words what I experienced. And so we're almost trying to describe the indescribable and to try to put it in some kind of order. But what I really wanted to do was I wanted to tell the story from their perspective. And I got to give Ted Savis a lot of credit here. He gave me the space to do it. if we're going to tell the story, and this is not a micro history either, I guess I want to make that clear to the listeners. It is a standard campaign narrative, just looking at things from a different facet. But, you know, the Stones River campaign took more than a week to complete, traversed a fair amount of ground. And to be able to really tell that story, it's very hard to do when you have like a 200 or 250 page book. I think the book ends up being like 650 pages. So it's a pretty beefy tome, but to tell the story with some deep details like that, you got to have the page count and the word count to do it. And in this case, Ted was, you know, give him all the credit. He was willing to take a chance, and I think it worked out all right. I think too, I knew right away that if I suggested a two-part book, that it wasn't gonna go anywhere. So, but yeah, really. So when I think about it, it was that decision, that active decision to take a different perspective and see where it kind of is exciting to see where it leads us, and also having the room to do it. If I had to tell this same story in, let's say, 150,000 words, a lot of those soldier stories that people really enjoyed probably would have been on the chopping block, because it's like you have to move the story forward. Well, what are you going to pull? What are you going to remove? Actual sections of the battle, or the real details of it? So, having the space to tell that story, I think, was crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, were there any individual soldiers whose stories really stuck out to you? I mean, you had mentioned that that you have a lot of research, obviously, and you've read through, I don't know how many soldiers' accounts, but I'm curious if any of them really stuck out to you when you were reading them, and you sometimes still think about.
Yeah, there's a couple. Probably one of my favorites, and you know, if there was a longer version of this man's diary, it ought to be published. Was Captain Ezekiel John Ellis. He was in, I believe, the 16th and the consolidated 16th and 25th Louisiana. He might have been in the 13th and 20th. I don't know, but he was in Adams Brigade, and his story is remarkably precise. It has some incredible details about Adams' attack on the Round Forest, so I love it just from that perspective. But he also struck me as a very fair observer. You know, I didn't see a lot of partisan bile in his writings. He wasn't, you know, talking about the dastardly Yankees or the Dan Yankees. I mean, he seemed like he was a genuinely, you know, almost called middle of the road observer. He has this incredible descriptions, the only time I've ever seen it, of we'll call it a rah-rah speech that Bragg gives Adams Brigade before they go into battle. And most people are like, well, where's Bragg on the battlefield? Well, before Adams' men went in, he was giving them a speech, basically telling them to, you know, strike for their homes in Louisiana. Got to remember, Bragg moved to Louisiana after he left the Army. So he considers himself a Louisianan. Now, he was born in North Carolina, but Ellis is one of the better Confederate ones. John Kennedy Street was in the 9th Texas. His memoir is quite good. Chaplain Bunting of the 8th Texas. The Texans seem to be quite good storytellers. Chaplain Bunting of the 8th Texas Cavalry, his stuff was good. Sam Watkins' description of getting wounded on the Wilkinson Pike is fascinating. On the federal side, probably too many to count. There's a soldier in the 21st Ohio, and I'm drawing a blank on his name at the moment, and that's really a shame. It's I'll probably think of it at 3 a.m. That's usually one of my more profound thoughts.
Isn't that when we all remember things?
John Beatty's memoir, he was a brigade commander at Stones River, is absolutely outstanding. I'd say it's almost lights out. But yeah, there were a lot of, you know, very very educated, very observant men of both armies who left a pretty incredible account of what they experienced. I think Dave Powell's pointed this out a couple of times too, and I think he's absolutely right. Stones River was one of those battles that the men had several months to process after it occurred. I mean, both armies essentially go into winter camp right afterwards, so they have plenty of time to kind of gather their thoughts and put them on paper, more so than maybe something like Chickamauga. Because the Federal Army's driven away from that battlefield, and almost immediately they're in siege operations at Chattanooga. I mean, just the pace of events really doesn't give them the time to kind of put their feet up and ruminate on lessons learned and whatnot. So that said, we have a very, very rich record about this battle. I wish we had some more sources on the Confederate side, but try to make the most out of the ones that we do have. But I think that helps with, from a historian's perspective, the challenge is gathering those accounts and then being able to go through and really kind of pick out the juicy and meaty quote, shall we say?
Sure. Well, and I want to go back just a little bit because you mentioned Bragg before. You mentioned Rosecrans, and I'm actually curious how you would assess their performance at Stones River accordingly, just kind of out of curiosity.
I think both of them deserved well of their countries. Bragg's performance has elements that I think are quite laudable, and other elements that are a little more questionable. One thing that I've never been able to square in my mind was, he had been given permission by Davis to retreat to the Tennessee if he felt necessary. I think it's a point to his credit that he decided to stay, understanding the logistical challenges he was facing. He really needed to be in Middle Tennessee as long as he could. The way that he chose to receive Rosecrans' army is quizzical to me, with a portion of his army on the eastern bank of Stones River, the other 2/3 or so on the western bank, and then rather than just taking a strong defensive position with Stones River in his front, he essentially launches an attack. Now the attack is widely successful, but ultimately, by the time, he keeps driving the Federal Army back upon itself. I mean, if you can imagine, the Federal Army starts out as this long, angular line, and you just take the right end and keep bending it back towards the left. Well, by the time you get to the end of the day, the Federal Army Bragg's done a remarkable job of concentrating it into one place. And as the army gets more concentrated, it gets becomes a much tougher nut to crack. And Bragg just doesn't have the forces to, at the end of the day, to seize the Nashville Pike. That was the Federals' key supply line back to Nashville. Had he been able to seize that, subsequent history might have changed, but he wasn't able to do so. And I think it's because he lost so many casualties getting the Federal Army driven back to that point. He just didn't have anything left in the tank. So, as I said, a lot of good things on his side. It does seem that he kind of got stuck on, these continual hammering attacks at the Round Forest. A brigade at a time were disastrous for the troops involved. Not one of his finer moments, although he would offer that was Polk's fault. But these guys are always blaming each other for whatever went wrong. Rosie's performance too is a bit mixed. As far as his personal courage and bravery, without question, was simply outstanding. When the disaster hit his army, he took that to heart and put his whole heart and soul into rallying the troops. Now, a lot of the troops saw this, and they really appreciated that he's out sharing the dangers with them. The more thoughtful soldiers might think, is this really the proper place for the commander of the army to be out positioning brigades and regiments? Shouldn't he be, is this really the right place for him? I think amongst some of the more traditionally West Point trained officers, that was kind of the the sentiment. I mean, the fact is, Rosecrans' army came near losing this battle on at least 2 different occasions. So the reason why you see Rosecrans all over the battlefields, because he had to be. He feels like his army is about to go to pieces on him. So he's trying to use his personal really much. He was a dynamo. He seemed like he was everywhere, but he had to be. I think his contribution was really that tough decision on the night of December 31st. Do we stay or do we retreat? And he elected to stay and fight it out. He had every justification to pull back to a different position and give up the field. I wish we really knew why he made that decision. He never really said. So as I said, for both commanders, mixed, it's Rosecrans' first time to bat with this army. Now, he'd been in battles before, but it is his first time with the Army of the Cumberland. Bragg had been in battle several times with this army, and his tactical performances are not his strong suit. I think he's a little better from a strategic standpoint. But yeah, I think both commanders deserve some credit for their country. I mean, they're dealing with a lot of their own internal challenges. I think Bragg's were more on the personal and the command level, as well as logistics. Rosecrans is pretty much won over the heart and soul of the Army of the Cumberland. So he doesn't have much in the way of command or personal problems, but he does have the challenging problem of being the attacking force in enemy country. He has to be very concerned about protecting his supply line to Nashville. What do you do with casualties? You send them back to Nashville and the Confederate cavalry gets them. What's going to happen? So he was hamstrung a little bit by his situation. But the fact of the matter is, as closely contended a battle as it was, eventually Rosecrans' men ended up holding the field. So he's victorious, and the Federal Army desperately needed a victory at this point in the war. I mean, they were reeling after Fredericksburg and then after the disaster out at Chickasaw Bayou. So
one quick note, something that you had mentioned in your book, I knew Rosecrans was Catholic, but I didn't realize how devout he was. I did not know that.
Daily Mass.
That was news to me. So I thought that was really interesting.
And Catholicism today, I think, is a broader social acceptance than it did during the war. Remember, right. America was largely founded upon, we'll say, Protestant principles. Not that there was no Catholics in the U.S.
Right. Yeah.
But they were still, we're not that far away from the Know Nothing Party of the 1850s, which was, one of the founding partners in the Republican Party. And one of the groups that they were opposed to was Catholics, because the thought was Romanists or Romanism. Their ultimate loyalty was to the Pope, not to the nation, amongst many other issues. But yeah, so Catholics were in some ways viewed with a bit of suspicion by, we'll call it your average, white American Protestants.
Sure. Well, even more amazing, you had mentioned that he converted to Catholicism.
Yeah, he did. At one point.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. So just a little side note, I guess.
Yeah,
but so just for clarification, going back to Bragg, do you think if he had withdrawn, it would have actually been seen more as a Confederate tactical victory in that sense?
If Rosecrans had
if Bragg had, like, if he chose to withdraw based upon what Davis had said or told him, do you think if he had withdrawn before he actually made that next attack, do you think it would have been viewed more as a Confederate victory or not?
It would, depending on who was doing the writing. The Confederate press was very, very partisan. Bragg was not a favorite with significant portions of the Confederate press.
Sure.
I almost wonder if he was in a damned if he did, damned if he didn't situation. He certainly would have had his official backing from Davis, if he decided rather than fight Stones River, he's just going to retreat, say 20. Let's say he retreats to where he ultimately retreats after Stones River, but he does it without the engagement.
Yeah.
Davis is not going to have a problem with this. Significant portions of the Confederate Congress and the press certainly will, because it will be viewed as a retrograde, another retreat. And I almost wonder in some ways if Bragg felt, because he chafed quite a bit under the criticism he received for the Kentucky campaign, which was a very daring endeavor, which I don't think quite gets the recognition that it should. We talk a lot about, Lee's army going into Maryland. I mean, really, how far do they get from their base? 50 to 100 miles at the most.
Yeah.
And, Bragg's operating 250 miles from Chattanooga, which is his primary base. And, by the way, he doesn't have a railroad to support him. He's got, everything's over mountain roads. And it was quite a feat to go as far as they did. The Army accomplished a fair amount. I mean, really, they bought the Confederacy an extra year of being able to hold Chattanooga at a minimum, and they threatened to almost turn the tide of the war. But the press, that I think the expectations were so high that when they weren't met, there was this, really, there was a crash at the end, almost like the Confederate press got on a sugar high, and when the crash came, it was really bad. But it was that Lee didn't seem to get the criticism that Bragg did. And, Bragg could offer that, actually his invasion had better results than Lee's, but, Lee's looked upon as a genius and Bragg as a cur.
Yes. Well, and I think that's a good point. It's something to seriously consider. But going back actually to the battlefield today, you had mentioned toward the end of your book, you actually spend a good portion of it talking about just preservation efforts. And so what does the battlefield look like today, and what are your hopes for it in the future?
So what is left of Stones River today is really you got to understand, when Stones River was founded, the national park was in 1927, and the original thought for Stones River was that it would be very similar to Chickamauga, from the standpoint it would be it was like 3,500 acres was initially what was, and this would have covered the entirety of the fighting in the battle. Congressional appropriations being what they were, I think initially it's maybe 500 or 600 acres that is set aside. The land that is set aside is significant, but I think it's significant because we have to remember that the advocate for this park was largely, I think his name is Joseph Grosvenor, who was at the time the chief historian at Chickamauga. Well, when they wanted to put the Stones River Park together, Grosvenor's observation was, well, the battlefield is so changed from when it was during the battle that there's only a couple of portions that are worth retaining. And it just so happened to be the places that his regiment fought. So when you look at, when you really look at the core Stones River battlefield, it's, that area near the Nashville Pike, it's that, of course, the National Cemetery, it's the Cedars. Grosvenor's regiment was the 18th Ohio, which was part of Timothy Stanley's brigade of Negley's division. So they obviously, their major contribution to the battle was fighting at the south end of the Cedar Force, which is preserved. And then in McFadden's Ford 2 days later, which is also preserved. Anything in between, So I know people think that's obscene, but it is what it is. I mean, you look at a map and when you realize who was consulted when they were deciding what land to really purchase for whatever reason, Grosvenor's voice was the big one. I think it's an absolute tragedy that none of the battlefield south of the Wilkinson Pike has been preserved. None of it. That's some of the most crucial fighting. It sets the stage for everything else. None of that's preserved. Now, the national park has added a few additional plots of land over the last few years. There is a section of land up, I think it's along US 41, just east of the park, and they used to be a factory, and they're in the process of it's brownfield, so there ain't a whole lot that they can do with it, but at least it's parkland now. Where I see the future for Stones River is that there are still a few open plots of land scattered hither and yon among the battlefield. There's some really good land directly west of the park. I did see the American Battlefield Trust has a campaign to preserve, I think, 38 acres out near Asbury Lane. The map that they show, I think, has some Confederate troops walking across it. That'd probably be Liddell's brigade, but that ground that they're looking at actually had a lot more cavalry action on it. So it absolutely would be worthwhile preserving. A little bit, not as far west, but a little bit west of the Stones River Park, there is a large open field. It stretches from Asbury Road all the way down to Wilkinson Pike. And I think it's called Wilkinson Farm. It's about the largest single undeveloped piece of property in that area. That would be an incredible one to secure. It probably would, cost half the national treasury with property prices being what they are in Middle Tennessee. But those grounds, there's still possibility. Most of anywhere the fighting was on January 2nd, that's all neighborhoods now. To recover any of that, I think would bankrupt a state. I mean, it was just, most of these houses were built, over the last 30 to 40 years. It was just, I see that they're making some gains in Franklin, which is inspiring. But when you look at what's being recovered in the cost, it's an extremely expensive proposition to recover developed property and turn it back into battlefield. And if we can get it, if we can secure it before it's been developed, far more cost effective. But pace of development in Murfreesboro is high. I mean, it's a fast growing region. The city, us Civil War buffs kind of have our perspective. We want all the land to be preserved.
Yeah, we do.
The city fathers and the city council and things like that have to. They weigh that in the balance against economic needs of the community. The property owners want to make they want to make money off of their investments and whatnot. So there's a lot of competing interests here. But I see that for Stones River, time's not our friend here. I really think with the pace of development in the area, that we probably have maybe a 5 to 10 year window left when there's still some substantial tracts that can be acquired. I think if trends continue, we have the same conversation in 2035. I think what we're looking at is an acre here, an acre there. Getting it all connect with the national park itself is probably impossible at this point. But there's still, I think, ample opportunity there, but we need to jump sooner than later.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it would be possible to even do something like I know on Missionary Ridge, that's a residential community, but somehow they're able to, it's like there's gaps between each of the homes. It's like there's a home and then there's a marker or a place to go and look at a certain event that happened during the battle. So I don't know if that's possible at Stones River. I've not been there, but I hope maybe they could achieve something like that.
Yeah. I know the city of Murfreesboro has been a good partner because they're very interested in securing green space. That's
that's good.
Definitely a pressing, and honestly, the way things are in Congress, getting enough congressmen and senators to agree on a bill to change the authorized boundaries of the actual national battlefield would certainly be challenging. I think really where the preservation victories will come will be in partnering with, like the city of Murfreesboro Parks, because essentially they could operate that property. It then would be preserved, as opposed to trying to add it to the boundaries of the national park, which, as I said, short of a significant change in how Congress seems to work anymore, I think that might be too high a hill to climb. But getting the local park system to take over that, there's nowhere near the hurdles, and the city has an interest in that because they need green space. I mean, the community. One of the most popular things at Stones River is you see families out taking walks, walking their dogs, getting out and running. So in some ways, it's almost become like an exercise park. I'm not, I'm two minds of that. On the one hand, I'm delighted people are going. I wish they were going for more, historical enlightenment, but at least they're going.
Right.
But the fact that they're there presents an opportunity for outreach, and maybe as they're running through, they a sign catches their attention and they stop and they read a wayside marker or something like that, and become more intrigued and more invested in what happened in their own communities. So,
Sure. Well, just to wrap up, the book you wrote is really, it's so good. But
thank you.
My question is, what do you hope readers take away from Held by the Acre?
Okay. I do hope that they have an emotional reaction to it. I hope that they walk away from it with a much deeper appreciation of the sacrifices of men of both sides, in fighting that war in general. I hope they realize how close a thing Stones River was, for both, really for the Federal Army. I mean, they came very close to losing on 2 occasions. The Confederates came very close to winning on a couple of occasions. A better appreciation, I think Bruce Catt might have wrote that Stones River was just a bunch of meaningless carnage, and I the more I think about that, the more it bothers me. That it wasn't meaningless carnage. It actually meant a great deal to the Union cause. Also, and I think I conclude the book talking about preservation. I hope that by helping folks understand what happened on the ground, that'll help light those fires of preservation. That, yeah, we do have, this land is worth preserving. There's things that happen here that are important to, U.S. history, to local history. And so in a way, it's we'll call it a clarion. It's a call to action. We've got a few years left before, Stones River is all developed, and let's get moving on this. So
good. Well, again, we are here with Dan Masters, who is the author of Held by the Acre. And Dan, I just want to say thank you so much again for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thanks for everyone for tuning in. Make sure to subscribe, and have a great week. All right. Thanks.